Swinson.
Thank you very much, Mr. Deputy Speaker. And I would like to begin by saying that my party, as was the case in the other place, is very supportive of this bill and will be supporting second reading today. And I would like to pay tribute to all of those who have campaigned for the Convention on Cluster Munitions and indeed this bill to ratify it, particularly, as already has been mentioned, the work of the Cluster Munition Coalition and Landmine Action. I'd also like to pay tribute to the work that my noble friend Lord Garden did on this issue, who's sadly no longer with us, and I think if he were here today he would be very pleased to see the progress that this bill is making. Of course, as we've heard, the vast majority of people killed by cluster munitions are civilians. In the different briefings I've read before this debate, I've seen estimates of anything between 85% and 98%. And it just seems to me that that figure alone makes it entirely unjustifiable to use weapons like this within a wartime, a war footing. The killing of civilians is always a tragedy, and the record of cluster bombs in doing this means that they are just wrong. They are not something which should be part of a responsible, civilised country's arsenal, because we just cannot justify weapons which do end up killing civilians in such huge numbers. But apart from the moral argument, there is the argument about counterproductivity. Increasingly in the conflicts which we have been involved in, the aftermath of securing support from the local population has been a vital part of our operations, and our experience in recent years, both in Iraq and Afghanistan, has proved, if indeed proof were needed in the first place, that the civilian deaths that occur make it much more difficult to undertake that process of winning hearts and minds. And of course, in trying to rebuild countries with agricultural production and economic development, the litter of cluster bombs making it so difficult to undertake basic food production and rebuilding in terms of infrastructure is far too much of a challenge, and frankly one that these countries can do without. As well as being dangerous to civilians, there's also a strong argument that militarily they are not effective as well, cluster munitions. I understand that 78,000 were used in Kosovo, but they only destroyed 30 major items of military equipment, so not exactly a successful military record either. And then, of course, there's just the human cost of what they do. And I recently had the opportunity to visit Chechnya as part of a delegation with the estimable Lord Judd from the other place, and on a delegation with the Parliamentary Group on Human Rights. And while that was fascinating and perhaps somewhat depressing as a visit in terms of human rights, one of the high points was going to speak to the children in the local schools and seeing how they're trying to rebuild the future of that country. That said, seeing with your own eyes children who are amputees, who have lost limbs as a result of the cluster munitions, of course, which in the 1990s were heavily used in the conflict by Russia, it really brings it home what a travesty and the lasting impact. And as has been said, it's not just about the killing that is done, but it's also about the maiming and the loss of limbs, which obviously have an impact throughout the entire course of that person's life, which is obviously particularly difficult to look at when you're talking about children. The Minister talked about the just way of waging war, and this has often been a sort of moral dilemma about how you can have a just war. But I think it is the case there are certain types of munitions, certain types of arsenal which we now come to a conclusion are not just and should not be used. And there has been excellent progress made, for example, on the topic of landmines and their use internationally, now much reduced. And I do very much hope that the cluster munitions will follow that success. Of course, we've heard other appalling weapons mentioned today. In particular, the Honourable Gentleman mentioned the white phosphorus that has been used by the US, particularly in Fallujah, in Iraq. And we have seen... well, indeed, the US was seen to use it in Fallujah, but yes, the Honourable Gentleman corrects me, Israel has also been using that in recent conflicts. And we have seen in recent weeks the BBC reports about the horrendous impact in terms of birth defects that are felt years later, with 13 times the rate of birth defects in Fallujah than what you see in Europe. And so the legacy issue of these weapons which are used in a conflict years later really is important. And that was also raised earlier in the debate about our responsibility for these weapons which we have used in the past. And I think it is quite right that we take our share of responsibility for clearing up the mess that we have left behind. I very much welcome this bill, although I do regret that it has taken so long for us to get to this stage. And the Honourable Member for Gower outlined the timeline in terms of the struggle it has taken to get to this point. The global movement for a ban on cluster munitions started in the late 1990s, and then the Oslo Declaration of February 2007 launched the diplomatic process leading to the Cluster Munitions Convention being adopted in May 2008, and then just in December there, the government introducing this bill. Back in 2006, my honourable friend, the member for North Devon, introduced a private member's bill on the issue, and unfortunately the government did not support it. And as has been mentioned, in the other place, Lord Dubbs and Elton introduced a private member's bill in 2006, and again the government did not support it. It has not been easy, sadly, to get the government on side. In the past, the government has argued that there is a difference between smart and dumb cluster munitions, and that it should be allowed to keep the smart ones. And I remember sitting here at question time listening to ministers defend smart cluster munitions. They had argued that such smart cluster munitions had a high success rate, but even those cluster munitions still kill civilians indiscriminately. And I'm glad the government has finally accepted that the right thing to do is to ban all of them, and I do welcome the government's belated acceptance of that fact. I'm sure we would all in this House hope to see this bill passed without any undue delay, because in this coming November we have the first meeting of the states parties, and of course ratification will give us greater influence in encouraging other states to do so. I'm very pleased to hear the progress that has already taken place in terms of destroying the UK's stockpiles of cluster munitions, with 13 million already having been destroyed. But there is just a few issues relating to the bill which I would be interested to raise and hear the Minister's response to when he sums up this debate. Turning first to the issue about stockpiling of cluster munitions on UK territory as per Article 3 of the Convention. The Minister today has said that all of the cluster munitions will be removed from UK territory by 2013, although the wording of Lord Malloch Brown was slightly different and was repeated by Baroness Kinnock on the 8th of December, which said there would be no permanent stockpiles of cluster munitions on UK territory 8 years after ratification. As has been mentioned, I note this is not on the face of the bill, and I would be interested to know why that is the case. And I would also be interested to challenge the Minister: does the expectation of the removal of stockpiles after 8 years represent a firm commitment? I also want to ask about the use of the word permanent. No permanent stockpiles of cluster munitions on UK territory. My understanding is the bill also prohibits the transfer of cluster munitions, and so we wouldn't expect there to be any non-permanent stockpiles either. There is also the issue about Diego Garcia in particular, which again has been raised in this debate. The wording that Baroness Kinnock has used regarding stockpiling on UK territory is that states parties are required to destroy all stockpiles of cluster munitions under their jurisdiction and control, and that stockpiles, US stockpiles on UK territory, are under UK jurisdiction but not control. So I would be keen to hear from the Minister whether that jurisdiction and control is an and or and. So the US being ultimately responsible for those stockpiles, do we not in the UK also have a responsibility for ensuring they are not stored on our territory? Furthermore, I think we do have to raise the point that the US Department of Defence has not always been entirely forthcoming in divulging details of its activities on that island. So I would be interested to hear how the government plans to ensure that the US complies with the new law in order to make sure that we are meeting our international obligations. In the House of Lords second reading debate, Baroness Kinnock said she would be speaking to colleagues in government about possible verification procedures, and I think this is a very important issue so that we can have confidence that by passing this bill we aren't just putting a bit of legislation on the statute book, but it will actually be meaningful and lead to any stockpiles being destroyed, and that verification is very important for that. Turning to Clause 9 of the bill, which relates to Article 21 of the Convention on Interoperability, as raised by the Honourable Member for Aylesbury, this will allow UK armed forces to participate in military actions and coalitions alongside the states who are not party to the Convention, which, as we've heard, includes the US, Russia, Brazil, India, Pakistan, China and Israel. Clearly, this is important to protect members of the UK armed forces in cases where they inevitably have to work with states who might be, unfortunately, choosing still to deploy cluster munitions. The wording from Baroness Kinnock in the second reading in the House of Lords said that I can reassure the House that in compliance with the Convention, no UK national will request the use of cluster munitions when the decision to do so is within their exclusive control. Now, I do understand that guidelines will be drawn up for our armed forces to set out clearly how this is to be understood and operationalised, but can the Minister give some further clarification on this? We obviously don't want our service personnel to be in difficult situations legally when they're in the heat of battle, but we also don't want a situation where British Armed Forces can do everything but pull the trigger, so to speak, when cluster munitions might be being used in joint operations. So I would hope the Minister today would be able to assure the House that all coalition partners will be urged at the strategic planning stage not to put UK nationals in that situation of having to request the use of cluster munitions even when the decision to do so is not within their exclusive control. In terms of the ratification by other states, I understand that the Foreign Office were writing in December to all Commonwealth foreign ministers urging them to sign the Convention, and it would be helpful to have any update on what responses have been received so far. To turn to the issue of indirect financing, I understand the Convention on Cluster Munitions doesn't actually mention financing, but the Government is taking measures to prevent the financing and development and production of cluster munitions. And therefore, I do welcome the Bill's provisions to prohibit that direct financing. But there's also measures the Government has announced to prevent indirect financing, as outlined on the statement on the 7th of December 2009. And I very much welcome the commitment to pursue this, albeit not through this bill, but through a voluntary code of practice for business. And this is clearly a complex issue, and thorough consultation is needed to find the best way of preventing such indirect financing. And I'm pleased that the Government has said they will not rule out any legislation to enforce a voluntary agreement if it were deemed to become necessary. Certainly on these benches we would be prepared to look at further legislation, and I hope that if that were deemed to be necessary, that would be something which would also have cross-party support. Mr Deputy Speaker, this is a good bill. It is doing something wholly positive which will help not only to save lives abroad but also to prevent horrendous maimings. The impact will partly come from the UK itself not using these cluster munitions, but also from the important role that we can play globally to encourage other states to change too. The Minister mentioned that 7 EU member states have not ratified, as well as 26 Commonwealth countries, and I hope that our influence will be used to try to reduce those numbers and get more people, more states signing up and ratifying the Convention. Of course, it's also regrettable that key countries like the United States have not yet agreed to the Convention, and for all of our special relationship, it's unfortunate we seem not to have been very able to convince them to act with responsibility as a major military power in the world. But Mr Deputy Speaker, I will be supporting the second reading. I hope very much that we can pass this bill in advance of the general election, and given the cross-party support for it, that whatever the result of the general election, whatever the outcome will be, that the UK government will be playing a leading role internationally in getting rid of these vile and indiscriminate weapons for good.